Counselor V. Elmora's crystalline eye structures caught the chamber light as she turned back to the council floor, prismatic refractions moving across the curved walls like scattered signals. The Dracul were not accustomed to silence as a response. In their governance tradition, a public statement left unanswered was a public statement agreed to. The legal architecture of their deliberative process was built on this principle. Had been built on it for 400 years of recorded jurisprudence. Vassie Elmora had made her declaration. The human had not objected. The record would reflect no counter-gamers offered. Engineering, V. Elmora said, addressing the broader assembly now, is a craft. We do not invite craftsmen to shape policy. We invite thinkers. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to rooms that agreed with her, not arrogance. Exactly, but the settled certainty of a person who has never needed to raise it. The Meridian proposal demonstrates technical competence. It demonstrates nothing further. We will note the presentation and move to the next item. Beside Innes, Theo Lindbergh's jaw had gone rigid. He was 28, her junior by 8 years, and he had not yet learned what 13 years of patience looked like from the inside. He had the particular kind of anger that comes from watching something unjust happen in slow motion, the kind that needs to be named, filed, objected to through proper channels before it calcifies into something less useful. He leaned toward Innes and breathed one word through his teeth. Say something. Innes did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Sarah, 3 rows forward and 2 levels down, sitting with her hands flat on the table and her right eye doing its habitual near close. She already did, Innes said quietly. 13 years ago. He turned to stare at her. She didn't explain. Below them, Sarah gathered her materials with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this outcome, down to the order in which she stacked her documents, and stood, and walked out of the chamber without looking back. The doors sealed behind her with a sound like a held breath finally released. V. Elmora had already moved to the next item. 3 rows back, Innes reached into the interior pocket of her attaché case and closed her fingers around a small analog device, a shutter trigger. Wireless, connected to nothing in this room, and held it without pressing it. Not yet. The network was ready. The archive was ready. 847 works, catalogued across 13 years, indexed and compressed and loaded into a broadcast relay that spanned 40 systems. Everything was ready. But the timing was Sarah's. It had always been Sarah's. 13 years earlier, Innes had been 23 and newly posted to the Dracul Ministry of Expression as a cultural attaché, her official function being the facilitation of cross-species artistic exchange. Her actual function being whatever Sarah Volkov eventually decided her actual function was. Her posting had come with a single briefing document, 4 pages, hand-delivered rather than transmitted. The document had no classification marking. It had no official header. It had Sarah's signature at the bottom, and one instruction at the top, which read "Cataloged everything they will not show us." Innes had not fully understood what that meant until the 3rd month, when she requested access to the ministry's restricted archive for research purposes and was told, politely and absolutely, that the archive contained materials deemed inconsistent with Dracul cultural standards and was therefore not available for external review. She had filed a formal inquiry. The inquiry was acknowledged, processed, and declined in 14 days. She filed a second inquiry through a different channel, declined in 9 days. A third, 6 days. The response time was decreasing. The answer was not changing. She began, instead, to find what existed outside the archive, not in the restricted holdings in the ordinary flow of cultural exchange, in the works that simply never appeared on any approved distribution list, in the music that transmitted from one station to another in personal packages rather than official channels, in the photographs that circulated among human communities off-station in formats too small to trigger the ministry's automated content review. The photographs were, in the early months, what broke the shape of what she was seeing into something clear. Human photographs, hundreds of them, architectural studies, family records, documentary images from Earth's northern industrial coast, portraits from stations that had existed for 3 generations and developed their own visual grammar. The ministry had reviewed them. Every one bore a review timestamp and declined to include them in any cross-species cultural exchange program. No stated reason. The decline code was Category 7, which the ministry's published guidelines defined as work insufficiently universal in its emotional reference points to merit broad distribution. Innes had looked at those photographs for a long time. They were not insufficient. They were specific. They were human faces, human light, human hands doing human work in human places. The ministry's cultural standards. She understood then, did not mean to narrow. They meant to other. The suppression was not a matter of quality. It was a matter of origin. She transmitted a 3-word message to Sarah Volkov that night, using a personal channel that predated her posting by for years. The message read, "Found the shape." Sarah's reply came in 40 seconds. It read, "Start counting." By the end of Ines' first year, she had cataloged 212 works. By the end of the second, 470. She had also identified, through Rid van Bayrick's research from inside Drac Cole academic circles, the precise mechanism of a review committee of 7. All Drac Cole, operating under a mandate that had been written into the ministry's founding charter without public announcement. The mandate's language carefully bureaucratic, its function precise. The committee reviewed all non-Drac Cole cultural submissions. The committee applied Category 7 to any work whose emotional framework derived from species-specific historical experience. In practice, any work that was not Drac Cole in its reference points failed. The standard was not quality. The standard was familiarity. The standard was us. 847 human works, across 13 years, declined under Category 7. Ines had every one of them. Cordelia Astrovi had been caught in the 7th year. Ines had not been there when it happened. She had been 3 stations away, running a separate catalog thread. When the message came through from Rid van, not a transmission, because transmissions left records, but a physical note passed through a contact at the neutral freight terminal on Quol RE6. The note had 6 words: "Cordelia is gone. Do not stop." Ines had sat with those 6 words for hours. Then she had gone back to work. The details came slowly, over the following weeks, through the careful second-hand channels that were the only safe conduit. Cordelia, 43, the oldest of the 3 operatives, born in Sofia, had been running a photography archive embedded inside a legitimate arts documentation project on a Drac Cole cultural station. She had been meticulous. She had been careful. She had been 7 years into a project whose purpose she believed in with a specific, quiet conviction of someone who has found the work that fits the shape of their life. The Drac Cole security apparatus had not found her through any technical failure. They had found her through a name of contact she had trusted for 4 years who had, one morning, decided that their own position was worth more than Cordelia's freedom. She was detained for 7 years. The work she had been cataloging when she was taken 114 photographs, mostly portraits, taken over 3 years on the station, were confiscated. Ines eventually recovered 61 of them through channels she still does not describe in writing. The other 53 are in the ministry's restricted archive, under Category 7, stamped with a decline date that corresponds to the day of Cordelia's arrest. Cordelia was released after 7 years. Not pardoned, released, which meant the formal charge remained on the record, which meant she could not return to Earth. She lives on a neutral transit station, Limen 4, in a 2-room unit that she has filled with prints. She sends photographs to Sarah twice a month. Always analog. Always in envelopes that smell faintly of the particular darkroom chemicals she has used since she was 19. Her camera collection, 17 cameras, each from a different decade. The oldest, a battered Rajnifizer from Earth's mid-20th century, lives in a cabinet in Sarah's quarters, because Sarah's quarters have a humidity control that Lee Menfer's unit does not, and the cameras need consistent conditions or the bellows deteriorate. Sarah checks the humidity gauge every morning before she checks anything else. Ines had learned this from Cordelia. In one of the photographs, not a note, not a message, just a photograph of the cabinet, slightly open, the humidity gauge visible in the frame, its needle pointing to the correct range, an image that meant she is still taking care of them. The afternoon after the council session, Ines sat in the transit lounge of the Galactic Council's civilian annex and opened her personal file on her tablet, and looked at the photograph for a long time. Outside the lounge's long window, the station's orbital ring was visible against the dark, haulers moving in slow arcs, a maintenance drone crawling along the docking arm with the patient mechanical purpose of something that has no opinion about what happens inside the structures it maintains. Theo sat down across from her without asking. He had the look of someone who had spent the past 3 hours converting anger into questions. It was a better look than the anger. "The network," he said. "The thing you mentioned. The 13 years. He paused. "How many people?" 3, Ines said. 4, counting Sarah. He absorbed this. "And the council doesn't know." "The council knows everything we filed. Every catalog entry has a reference number. Every broadcast license application is logged. Every technical specification for the relay network went through the standard regulatory review." She set the tablet down. "They didn't read it." Theo was quiet for a moment. "Then that's insane." "No," Ines said. That's filing. He almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when something is both genuinely absurd and completely serious at the same time, and they don't yet know which register to put it in. When? He asked. When Sarah decides. And she'll know when that is. Ines looked out at the orbital ring, at the slow arcs of the haulers, at the drone on the docking arm. She's been waiting 13 years for V.L. Mora to say exactly what V.L. Mora said today. She said, she knew the word. She knew child. She told me, 11 years ago, that V.L. Mora's documentation indicated that particular word as her category of dismissal for non-Drac Coal technical specialists. Ines picked up the tablet again. She waited for the word. Theo stared at her. We filed everything correctly. Ines said, every relay license, every broadcast registration, every archive accession number, all of it is in the public regulatory record. Any intelligence desk in this station could have read it. She closed the tablet case with a sound like a soft shutter click. They didn't read it. That is not our problem. What the Drac Coal Ministry of Intelligence had logged, in the 13 years of Project Quiet Lens, was the following: 1 cultural attaché posting, renewed annually, with standard performance reviews, 1 academic research fellowship in Drac Coal institutional history, producing 3 published papers on pre-expansion cultural exchange, 1 regulatory filing for a multi-system broadcast relay network, approved under the Galactic Communications Compact's Open Access Clause, categorized as a cultural archive distribution system and assigned a class for non-commercial license, and 1 formal catalog, submitted to the Galactic Cultural Registry, containing 847 entries under the heading Human Cultural Works Pending Distribution Review. Pending. Not suppressed. Pending. The distinction was Ridvan's idea. He had spent 10 years in Drac Coal academic circles, publishing careful, unremarkable papers, attending conferences, building the kind of professional reputation that generates invitations to review committees. In the 9th year, he had been invited to sit on the ministry's Category 7 review panel as an external observer transparency measure the ministry had introduced after a minor diplomatic complaint from the VET Carey delegation about process visibility. Ridvan had attended every session for 14 months. He had spoken rarely. He had listened. He had, at the end of those 14 months, Sartos produced a 40-page internal analysis that he shared with no one at the ministry, and instead transmitted to Sarah Volkov through a channel that looked, to any automated review system, like a standard academic pre-publication draft. The analysis documented, with the precise sourcing of someone who had spent a decade becoming trustworthy enough to be in that room, that the Category 7 standard had been applied in consistency across species, with a specific inconsistency, meaning that Drac Coal works depicting species-specific historical experience were routinely approved, while non-Drac Coal works depicting equivalent experience were routinely declined. The standard was not emotional universality. The standard was Drac Coal. The documentation was complete. The sources were primary. The conclusion was not a conclusion, it was a record. Sarah had read the analysis in a single sitting. She had filed it in the archive under accession number 7QL94, publicly accessible through the Galactic Cultural Registry. Then she had sent Ridvan a message that read added to the broadcast queue. He had number 848 in the pending distribution file was Ridvan's 40-page analysis of the Category 7 review process, formatted as a cultural document, classified under the registry's academic works category, bearing no marking that would distinguish it from the other 847 items in the queue. It would broadcast alongside the photographs and the music in the films. It would reach every species in the network at the same moment. It would arrive not as an accusation. Accusations could be contested, but as a record. Records could only be acknowledged or denied, and denial required the denial to enter the record, which made the denial part of the story. Sarah had explained this to Ines once, a long time ago, when the project was still in its 2nd year and the catalog was still under 300 entries, and the question of whether any of it would ever matter was still open in a way it no longer felt open now. They had been in a darkroom, Sarah's, the one she kept in her quarters on Station Calder 7, the one that smelled of fixer and old paper. Sarah had been developing a photograph, her right eye closed in its habitual way, the red safe light making the room feel like the interior of a held thought. She had held the developing tray at a shallow angle and said, without particular emphasis, humans are the only species that prepare for forgiveness, and the only species that document every insult until forgiveness becomes unnecessary. Ines had been quiet. The photograph in the tray had been resolving slowly a portrait, someone's grandmother, taken on a station that no longer existed. Which one is this? Ines had asked. Both, Sarah had said. Always both. The photograph had finished developing. Sarah had lifted it from the tray with tongs and held it up to the safe light, her right eye already closing slightly around the image the way it always did when she was deciding whether something was worth keeping. She kept it. Now in the transit lounge of the Galactic Council Civilian NX, Ines closed the photograph on her tablet and looked at the time. The council session had ended 4 hours ago. Vaisal Mora's declaration was in the permanent record. Sarah's silence was in the permanent record. The network was ready, and the archive was ready, and the broadcast relay's class for license was valid and logged. And 848 entries sat in the pending distribution queue of the Galactic Cultural Registry. Waiting. Theo was watching her. She's in the dark room, Ines said. Not because she knew this, but because she knew Sarah. She develops when she's thinking. She's been developing since she left the chamber. Thinking about what? Ines looked out at the orbital ring again. One of the haulers had changed course slightly, a minor arc correction. The kind of adjustment that maintenance systems make without human input. The kind that means nothing. Or the kind that means the moment has arrived and the correction is not a correction, but the beginning of a different geometry entirely. She had no way to tell from here whether it's time. She said. Theo leaned forward. Is it? Ines reached into her attaché case and felt the shape of the shutter trigger with her fingers. Cool. Smooth. The particular weight of something built for a single precise action, designed to be pressed exactly once, waiting for the hand that knows the right moment. Not her hand. Not yet. Ask her. Ines said. Sarah Volkov's darkroom on Station Calder 7 was 7 feet wide and 11 feet long, and it smelled, as it always had, of sodium thiocephalton old paper and the particular metallic sharpness of developer solution that has been used so many times and has taken on a character of its own. The red safe light made the room the color of a thought not yet finished. She had been in here for 4 hours. Theo found her through Ines, who had given him the station number without comment. He knocked twice, waited, heard nothing. Knocked once more. The door opened. Sarah looked at him the way she looked at most things, with her right eye already doing its slight close. Already framing, already deciding whether the composition was worth the exposure. Ines said, You'd want to know when I'd stop being angry. Theo said, Have you? I've been angry for 4 hours. I think that's probably enough. He looked past her into the red-lit room. At the developing trays, at the line of photographs hung to dry along the far wall. Portraits, mostly. Faces he didn't recognize from places he had never been. Are those Cordelia's? Sarah said. The ones I was able to get back. She stepped aside to let him in, which he took as an invitation. And he entered carefully, the way people enter rooms that belong entirely to someone else. 61 of the 114 she was cataloging when they took her. Theo looked at the photographs for a long moment. They were extraordinary, in the specific way that photographs are extraordinary when the person behind the camera understood that light is not decoration but information, each one precise, each one patient, each one showing a human face in a human place with the unsuccessful dignity of someone who did not know they were being preserved. A woman at a workbench. A man reading in low gravity, his book held above his face. 3 children in a corridor, playing a game whose rules were not visible but whose pleasure was. An elderly person sleeping in a chair by a viewport. The stars behind them out of focus, the lines of their face, perfectly sharp. She took these. Theo said. It was not a question. 7 years of her life. Sarah said. She was at the developing tray, her back to him, working with the unhurried precision of someone for whom this process is not a task but a practice. Tongs. Shallow angle. The slow rock of the tray. 53 are still in the Ministry archive. Under Category 7. Stamped the day they arrested her. Theo was quiet. The photographs dried in the red light. Outside, the station hummed with the low frequency of recycled air. She sends me to a month. Sarah said. Still. From Lee Men 4. She lifted a photograph from the tray, a new one. Still resolving. The image emerging from gray into specific, and held it to the light. Her right eye closed around it. She photographs the station, what she can see from her window, what she has for breakfast, the view of the docking ring in different weather conditions. They pause. She's been photographing the same window for 6 years. There are small differences, every time. Theo understood. Then, what he was standing in, not a darkroom, a record. A very long, very careful, very patient record of everything the council had decided was not worth keeping. He looked at Sarah's hands on the developing tongs. Steady. Completely steady. When? He asked. Sarah set the photograph on the drying line. Straightened. Checked the humidity gauge on the cabinet against the far wall, the one that held 17 cameras, each from a different decade. Bellows intact. Mechanisms clean. The needle was in the correct range. She noted it the way she noted it every morning, without particular emphasis, then turned around. "Now," she said. The broadcast went out at 3:14 station time, when the Galactic Council's main session hall was empty and its recording systems were in their automated overnight archives cycle, and its 40-system relay network was processing routine maintenance traffic with the minimal staffing of the Deep Watch shift. This was not an accident. The class for broadcast license that Project Quiet Lens held under the Galactic Communications Compact's Open Access Clause specified. In its technical appendix, that large volume cultural archive distributions should be scheduled during low traffic windows to minimize relay congestion. The technical appendix had been written by Innes. The scheduling window had been chosen 3 years ago. The license had been approved, reviewed, and logged without a single frag. Sarah loaded the camera, pressed the shutter. 40 systems heard the click. In the 2.3 seconds that followed, 848 files, photographs, film sequences, musical recordings, Redvan's 40-page analysis moved through the relay network at the speed that regulated broadcast traffic moves, which is to say the speed of light multiplied by the efficiency of infrastructure that has been optimized over for centuries of interstellar communication. The files arrived simultaneously at every registered receiver in the network. They were not encrypted. They were not marked sensitive. They carried, at the top of each file, a registry accession number, a catalog date, and a status designation. Pending distribution review. No longer pending. Innes was in the transit lounge when her tablet registered the broadcast confirmation. She did not move for a moment. The shutter trigger was still in her hand, its function now complete. Its single precise action performed. Outside the lounge window, the orbital ring was the same as it had always been, hollers and slow arcs. The docking arm extended, the maintenance drone making its patient circuit. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. Theo, beside her, watched the broadcast propagation map populate on his screen. 40 systems, each lighting up as the files arrived. A slow bloom of points across the chart that looked, in the pale blue of the display, like a photograph developing. 40 points of light. 40 systems receiving. Simultaneously, the 114 photographs Cordelia had taken before they took her. The 733 other works that the Category 7 committee had decided were insufficiently universal. And the document that explained, with complete primary sourcing, exactly what that decision had meant. "It's going," he said. "It went," Innes said, "on the Dracol Cultural Station Ved HFY, in a small administrative office on the station's 3rd residential room. A junior clerk named Ysolde was working the overnight shift when her terminal registered an incoming distribution from the Galactic Cultural Registry. She had been processing routine accession confirmations for 2 hours, the kind of work that fills the overnight shift with a low, manageable tedium. File arrives. Reference number checked. Confirmation logged. Next file. She opened the new distribution, noted the accession numbers, began to log the confirmation. Then she stopped. The 43rd file in the queue was a musical recording. The registry metadata listed it as Human Cultural Work Instrumental Vocal Composition Origin Station Keter to Decade 2182 Status Pending Distribution Review Category 7 Decline 48 of Decline 14.072187. Ysolde recognized the melody in the first 4 seconds. Her grandmother had sung it to her on visits to Keter 2, when Ysolde was very small. Before the station was decommissioned, her grandmother had sung this particular sequence of notes in the particular rhythm that meant sleep now. "The dark is safe. I'm here." Ysolde had assumed it was a Dracol melody. She had assumed this because her grandmother was Dracol, and the melody was her grandmother's, and she had never thought to ask where a melody comes from because melodies are not the kind of thing you think to ask about. The recording was not Dracol. The recording was human. It had been composed on Station Keter 2 in the 2182 by a human musician whose name was in the metadata, whose work had been reviewed by the Category 7 committee in 2187, and declined, and filed, and not heard again until 314. Ysolde closed both eyes. In Dracol physiology, this was the response to information that required the existing framework to be restructured before the new information could be placed anywhere. Both eyes closed simultaneously. The crystalline structures dimmed. The refraction stopped. They held pause while the architecture of understanding shifted to accommodate what it had just received. Her grandmother had learned that melody from a human, had carried it without knowing its origin, had passed it to Ysolde without knowing, and the committee that had declined the recording in 2187 had included, in its written determination, The phrase, insufficient emotional universality, which meant, why Soldi now understood, that a melody her grandmother had sung her to sleep with had been judged too narrow for general distribution. Too not us. She sat with this for a long time. Then she opened a correction notice, because she was a clerk and correction notices were her instrument, and she began to write. The notice grew. She kept writing. She submitted it. It was 300 pages long. Councillor Velmora received the broadcast notification at 7 o'clock station time, when her personal aide brought the morning summary and set it on her desk with the particular careful placement of someone delivering news they do not know how to categorize. Velmora read the summary. She read it again. Her crystalline eye structures caught the morning light from the viewport and held it. Perfectly still, not refracting. She had been in Drac Coal governance for 31 years. She had seen countergamons. She had seen formal objections. She had seen protests filed through proper channels and improper ones. She had seen the full range of responses that species produced when they felt their position had been misrepresented in a council session. She had never seen this. 848 cultural works, broadcast across 40 systems through a legitimately licensed relay network using a registry accession number that had been sitting in the public filing system for 13 years, arriving not as an accusation but as a distribution, with no accompanying statement, no demand, no position paper, no request for reconsideration. Just the works, just the record, and the analysis. Ridvan's 40-page document, file number 848, formatted as a cultural work, arriving with the same quiet registry metadata as everything else, its contents moving through 40 systems as cleanly as a photograph through fixer solution. Velmora closed her eyes. The silence, she understood now, had not been concession. She had read it as concession because her framework had no other category for public non-responsons in Drac Coal deliberative tradition. Silence after a statement was agreement with the statement, and she had spent 13 years believing she had been agreed with. She had cited the human engineer's non-responsons in 3 separate internal reports as evidence of the validity of the council's position. She had used the phrase acquiescence confirmed in 2 of those reports. The silence had been construction. While she had been writing reports about acquiescence, someone had been building a network. The silence, she said aloud, to no one in particular, to the empty office, to the morning light coming through the viewport. The silence was louder. Her aide, standing near the door, did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. It was not a statement that invited response. It was a statement that arrived already complete, already closed. The kind of sentence that a person says when they are not speaking to anyone in the room but to a version of themselves that needs to hear it said. Velmora sat with it for 4 minutes. Then she opened her terminal and began to draft a communication to the Open Assembly Formation Committee. Because she was a counselor, and that was her instrument, and there were things that needed to be done now that could not be undone and should not be, across 40 systems. In the hours that followed, the broadcast moved through the ordinary channels of cultural reception morning feeds, overnight queues, the slow diffusion of content through the networks that carry everything from administrative bulletins to personal correspondence. The Quol-Ari Academic Network registered the human architectural photographs and immediately flagged 6 of them for inclusion in their comparative structural studies program, their electroreceptive antennae spreading wide in the unconscious physical expression of intellectual stimulus. The HFY Cultural Preservation Institute submitted a formal request for 3 of the musical recordings before noon. The HFY Diplomatic Archive, whose crystalline vocal chambers produced a faint harmonic chord that their staff noted as the particular frequency associated with encountering something worth keeping, requested a complete catalog of the pending works. Nobody called them insufficient. Nobody called them too narrow. The Open Assembly was constituted 14 days after the broadcast, in a session that lasted 6 hours and produced a founding document whose preamble listed 14 names. The reading of the preamble took 4 minutes. Each name was read once, clearly, by the session's designated reader, a HFY delegate whose formal address never wavered, whose translucent bone structure showed no visible stress lines in the neck, which in HFY physiology indicated genuine composure rather than suppressed alarm. Inna sat in the observer gallery and listened to the names. The transparency clause was adopted unanimously. No species may suppress under species cultural expression. All works held under Category 7 and equivalent suppression designations across all member governance systems to be released into the public archive within 90 days. The Category 7 review process formally dissolved. The committee's records sealed pending an independent review whose composition would include representatives from every species whose works had been declined. The 14th name in the preamble was Cordelia Astrovi, on Leman 4, in a two-room unit on the station's civilian residential ring. Cordelia watched the session on a small screen propped on the desk beside the window that looked out at the docking ring. She had been watching since the session opened, when the reader reached the 14th name and set it clearly into the record of a governing body that would now be permanent. Cordelia did not move for a long moment. Outside her window, a supply hauler was making a slow approach to the docking arm, its running lights blinking in the patient rhythm of a vessel that has made this approach many times before and expects to make it many times again. The light from the screen was blue-white against her face. She picked up the camera from the desk, a small Rajna, not one of the 17 in Sarah's cabinet, but her own working camera, the one she had bought on Leman for 3 years after her release, because she could not stop. She raised it, closed her left eye, looked through the viewfinder with her right, the way she always had, and framed the hauler against the docking arm against the dark, and pressed the shutter. The click was very quiet in the small room. She would develop it later and send it to Sarah. Sarah would put it on the drying line in the red light of the darkroom and look at it with her right eye already doing its slight close. Already deciding whether the composition was worth keeping, she would keep it. She kept all of them. 3 weeks after the Assembly's founding session, Sarah was alone in the darkroom. The humidity gauge on the cabinet read correctly. The developing tray held a new photograph, just beginning to resolve shapes emerging from gray, not yet specific. Through the small viewport above the developing bench, the stars were visible, the particular cold clarity of them that exists only in deep station orbit where no atmosphere softens the light. She stood at the tray and watched the image come forward. The photograph was of a window, Leman 4's docking ring. Seen from 2 rooms away, the hauler's running lights caught at the edge of the frame. The image was precise, patient, taken by someone who understood that light is information, and that information, preserved, does not diminish. Sarah's right eye was almost closed, framing what the next 13 years would look like. She did not know whether the Assembly would hold, whether the transparency clause would survive its first challenge, its second, its 10th, whether YSOLD's 300-page correction notice would be the first of many or an anomaly that the system absorbed and forgot, whether the species that had closed both eyes when the broadcast arrived would, in time, open them again, look at what was there, or whether the closing of the eyes was only the first motion of a longer turning away. The photograph finished developing. Sarah lifted it with the tongs and held it to the safe light. Her right eye settled into its frame. She kept it.